Hello and welcome to the Mediascope. Yesterday we were set to discuss with Mr. Andrew Arato, a professor of political and social theory, on the constitutional trajectory of Turkey since 1980s. But due to a technical complication, we couldn't realize the interview. But here we are again, and we hope to realize the interview properly today. Professor Arato, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for speaking with me.
Welcome back, I should say. So, first question I want to ask you about the 1982 Constitution. You argue that the 1982 Constitution established a state within a state, and one being superior to the other through its what you call tutelary institutions. So, how do you think this has affected Turkey's constitutional trajectory since 1980s?
Well, it affected it because political actors, almost from the first moment on, initially under the leadership of Mr. Turgut Özal, wished to move away from that dual structure in the direction of a constitutionalist state. In other words, a constitutional democracy, which a kind of dual state with a state within the state is not. And this means that from the first moment on, when the Constitution was promulgated, there's a fight between the military tutelage system and constitutionalist forces in Turkey. This continues until at least 2004, 2005.
Yeah. And in 2004 and 2005, where you referred to, there seems to be a common view that the AKP took very crucial steps for constitutionally democratizing Turkey. But you argue in your chapter on Turkey that the AKP was not the initiator but the continuator of the process that had already begun during the Troika coalition. So does that mean that AKP's initial role to democratize Turkey is overestimated?
Well, the two statements are compatible. That is, the process begins already with the first amendments of 1987, which were under the leadership of Mr. Özal. The most important ones were made in mid-1990s, when AKP didn't yet exist. The role of the Welfare Party, its forerunner, was ambivalent. Better and more amendments could have been made if the Welfare Party did not almost always insist on religious interests being the most important trade-off. In any case, the Welfare Party was gone. The Virtue Party, too, was dissolved. AKP was the next party of political Islam. And it, for reasons probably both genuine and to some extent strategic, it chose to restructure itself, reconstruct itself. As such, it participated in the next amendment wave of the 2000s until 2004 or 5. And so in that sense, it did help make important amendments when it had a very big majority, but it was a continuator, not an initiator of the overall process.
I see. And looking at the constitutional amendments that were made during AKP era, you make a distinction between those amendments that were made through consensus seeking and those others who were made through majoritarian methods. Why do you think this distinction is important?
Well, I mean, in the early 2000s, the major parties, and at a certain point there was only the CHP in parliament together with the AKP, agreed to amend the constitution in important ways, thereby at least thereby producing an outcome that was at least arguably representative of different segments, perhaps most segments of Turkish society. The huge majority that that the AKP, however, achieved in the second election in which it was victorious, I don't know the exact date now, maybe 2004 or 5, enabled it to also, according to the rule of the Constitution, to also change the Constitution according to its own majority alone. And this, to the extent that such a project was undertaken, it would make the constitutional changes the products not of the whole society, but only of one important segment of it. So there's a fundamental difference between consensual and imposed constitutions, and the AKP shifted in its interest from one to the other.
Yeah. Can we also conclude that consensus seeking is a viable option to bypass tutelary institutions for constitutionally democratizing the country?
Well, this, I think, is right, obviously. On a more symbolic level, with respect to the military, if all the parties agree, as they did, for example, in many cases in the 1990s, even if the military doesn't like the change, it would have to undertake action against all the combined forces of Turkish society, and this it was reluctant to do. Although in some instances it still used that tutelary power to the extent that one treats the Constitutional Court as itself a tutelary institution. I would not myself. I think it was much more ambivalent on this matter. Then a consensual process also avoids the Constitutional Court's entry into the process, because it takes 110 deputies of Parliament to appeal to the Constitutional Court to review a constitutional amendment. If fewer than 110 remain in opposition to a package, that ability to appeal to the court is gone.
So you say that the Constitutional Court cannot act in its own to review a constitutional amendment?
It does not have that power under the same Constitution.
Yeah. But
with respect to amendments, constitutional amendments, it requires either the President of the Republic or 110 deputies, 110 plus 1 maybe, I'm not sure now, it's 110 or 111 deputies to actually appeal to the court. This indeed happened in 2008 during the famous headscarf amendments to Articles 10 and 42 of the Constitution. They were made in a majoritarian way. The AKP had support of also MHP, but the CHP still had over 110 deputies and was able to appeal to the court, and the court invalidated the amendments.
Yeah. And you argue in your chapter that especially after 2007, AKP increasingly resorted to its majority in the parliament to come up with its own constitutional project. And that led to a horse race, quote-unquote horse race, between the government or the AKP and the Constitutional Court that eventually led AKP to come up with 2010 amendments.
Right.
So,
yeah, the horse race perhaps began in 2007 over the presidency, where the Constitutional Court stopped one attempt to install an AKP president, Mr. Abdullah Gül, and then allowed another attempt to do just about the same through a referendum. So the first round of the horse race was a draw. In 2008, the headscarf amendments were invalidated, and so this round of the horse race was won by the court, and indeed, subsequent to that, there was an attempt to dissolve the AKP, which, however, very weakly, but still significantly, was won by the AKP because the court could only generate a 6-5 vote to dissolve it.
Yes.
So the third round was this dissolution attempt, and the AKP won that round, if not by very much. But it still seemed to the AKP that its constitutional project for the future is blocked by the Constitutional Court, and as a result, the 2010 amendments were made with the help of a referendum, and that was the round of the horse race that was decisively lost by the Constitutional Court.
Yes, and let's talk about the substance of 2010 constitutional amendments, because these are also important in analyzing today's authoritarianization. You'd say that those amendments were an attack against constitutionalism. Could you please elaborate on this?
Yes. The amendments were constructed in a very clever way. 26 of them, of which I would say about 20 were quite positive.
Yes.
In terms of recognition of unions, gender relations, and all kinds of things which liberal Democrats could applaud. These did not attack either democracy or constitutionalism, on the contrary. But about 6 provisions having to do with the Constitutional Court and the judicial oversight were constructed in such a way that formally I always took them to be attacks on constitutionalism, and I warned all my Turkish friends, both on CNN Turk and in Milliyet, I think, that they should not vote for the whole package because of these amendments. Now, they represented formally an attack on constitutionalism because to reduce the power of the court to review amendments to a 2/3 vote very much weakened it. And of course, even more importantly, by putting new members onto the court whom the government could select, amounted to a kind of court packing whose aim is always to produce a court pliant to the interests of government. Now, the reason why I say this is not just an attack on a court, but on constitutionalism, is that by its very definition, constitutionalism represents restraints on the governing authority, on its arbitrary will, forcing it to stay within the limits of the Constitution. I think that such limits, in order for them to become really constraining limits, in order to remain viable limits, require an enforcer. And such an enforcer under modern conditions can only be the Constitutional Court. The population has a form of enforcement would be to make a rebellion or revolution, which under modern conditions would be extremely unlikely. And so the weakening of the court, the weakening of the enforcement power of the court with respect to constitutional amendments especially, means that the government was seeking to create a free hand for itself and to create an opening for its subsequent constitutional projects, which already could be seen at the time had to do with presidential government.
Yes. So from what you say, as far as I understand, those amendments are therefore very much related to the process of authoritarianization that we are currently experiencing in Turkey. So what do you think specifically, what role do you think those amendments played in this process?
Well, the role they play is a formal one. In other words, they eliminate the possibility of the Constitutional Court reviewing other constitutional changes. If you want, the goal of those amendments ultimately was to open a free terrain for other amendments. And in this respect, the only ones that we can point to are the ones in 2017. So that's the formal link. The 2010 amendments make the 2017 amendments possible. Now, why wait so long? In between, several things happened. Turkey had elections. In the first of those elections, the AKP lost its constitution-making majority. in other words, lost the 3/5 that we were required, even with a referendum, to change the constitution. 2010, they had it, and they could do this, but after the next election, they lost that ability. So what they tried for a certain period was to create a kind of consensual process which would give them the presidential government that they actually wanted. And I think their first hopes had to do with the Kurdish party. Currently, negotiations are engaged with Mr. Öcalan. And so the Kurdish party might have been a candidate in principle to give them the constitutional outcome that they wanted, if they were willing to give great concessions to the Kurds. It turned out that this did not happen. I don't want to explore now the historical reasons, but the formation of the HDP, I think, had a lot to do with the failure of this particular strategy. The next time around, the AKP even lost its governing majority in 2015, I think. And so this not only made constitutional change, but even governing very difficult. So you know what happened subsequently. The war with the Kurds was reopened. Whose fault? I don't have to get into that. Probably there was fault on both sides. And so at that particular point, the AKP made another choice, which I think maybe from beginning, or at least in terms of its result, led to its ability to make the constitution again. And that choice was to move in a nationalist direction. The MHP may have encouraged that choice in secret negotiations. I don't know if that is true or not. But in any case, opening the war with the Kurds reopening the war with the Kurds, linked the MHP and AKP much closer together than they were previously. This helped both to win the election in the second election of 2015 and gave the AKP once again the 3/5 majority needed to make the constitution. And this time, with the support of the MHP, they undertook that effort. Now, had there been a strong constitutional court in place, they would have had to overcome the possible hurdle of an appeal to the court and a possible adverse decision. But this was already gone as a result of the 2010 amendments.
Yes, I see. One important question I want to ask, if you don't mind. Many people who voted for the constitutional amendments in 2010, they thought that, maybe you are also aware of this, they thought that the Constitutional Court was a tutelary institution itself. So in order to break this tutelage, they voted for the constitutional amendments. So, but you say that had Constitutional Court been much powerful today, without the constitutional amendments of 2010 approved by referendum, Turkey wouldn't have maybe experienced this de-democratization. Is it right?
Right. I mean, this argument was made by Mrs. or Miss Azli Bali, who teaches, I'm not sure at which law school in California, or Oregon perhaps, and an American scholar of Turkish background.
Yes.
She even called the court unpacking, because by adding new justices, a democratic elected body, the parliament, or a democratic elected government, was able to counteract the Kemalist majority in the court, which in my mind hardly existed by this particular time. I suspect that Ms. Bali is very sorry now about the ultimate results of what she at that time supported, and so are many others who voted for this. I don't know how many of the listeners have voted for the 2010 amendments. It's an interesting question how many of them are really sorry now that they opened the way to the kind of turn that occurred later in the same decade. Now, my analysis from the outset accepted the idea that a very strong constitutional court could be seen occasionally as a as a tutelary institution. But in my reconstruction, especially focusing on the previous court under the 1960 Constitution, indicated that there were many cases also when the court was a defender of fundamental rights, of human rights, against the government and even against the military. And I could see how through through that period, many of the limits which were eventually extended by the AKP were set up by the military supported government, or rather imposed by the military on governments. In that sense, the court and the military became, in some respects, antagonists already in the 1970s, and I think the restriction on the court's ability to review amendments that was put into the 1982 Constitution was a result of these fights. So in my reconstruction, the court was oscillating between a defender of rights and a defender of the tutelary institutions, and its identity problems were not yet resolved in the first decade of the 21st century. Nevertheless, with that said, I thought that it was extremely important that the court continued to play its role in a strong way, because it was, for example, only one of the institutions, perhaps the most important institution, that could impose a consensual process on the constitution makers. I mean, the previous argument I made was that only as long as there were 110 deputies, could the Constitutional Court be called into action on the question of a constitutional amendment. This sets up a kind of incentive for the lawmaker to include enough deputies in any constitution-making package that the 110 are not available. So, in a way, the threat of the court, even if it comes from a tutelary past, is a way of incentivizing, of creating incentives for a process in which there are enough deputies involved in constitution making so that the court cannot enter. This disappears to an important extent with the 2010 amendments. The incentive to engage in consensual constitution making becomes then a pure function of elections on the one side and of the constitutionalist loyalties of all the parties. But elections, as you could see in the 2000 period after 2010, could actually make it difficult for the AKP to create its own constitution all alone. But the second factor, the loyalty, the constitution's loyalty of all the parties, was an important factor too, because if their support would drop under the 3/5, as long as they had a partner, they could still create a majoritarian constitution, which is what they finally wound up doing. So the court, yes, had a divided identity, tutelary institution or defender of rights, but its very structural presence was a consensus forcing or consensus incentivizing device.
Yes, I see. Professor, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure having you.
It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that things work out in your country.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Dear watchers, we have discussed today the constitutional trajectory in Turkey since 1980s. Thank you for watching.